Hey there! Tonight we're diving into one of the strangest corners of history. The kind of story that sounds made up, but isn't. So get cozy, dim the lights, and let's begin. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when belief was strong, logic was flexible, and your worst enemy could just as easily be a pig. Alright, let's talk about pigs. Yes, pigs. Because in medieval Europe, animals weren't just food or farmhands. Sometimes they were criminals. Now you might wonder, why would anyone, especially in the 13th century, drag a pig into court? Was the pig holding a grudge? Plotting a bacon rebellion? Well, in one famous case from 1386, a pig in France was actually arrested for attacking a child. The child, sadly, didn't survive, and the town took the matter very seriously. The pig was given a full trial. There was a judge, a prosecutor, witnesses, even a legal representative for the pig. Yes, someone actually stood there and said, "Your Honor, my client was acting under stress." And this wasn't a one-off event. Across medieval Europe, animals were routinely put on trial for crimes ranging from property damage to murder. These trials were fully documented. Some even had transcripts. Imagine flipping through dusty court records and finding, "The accused oinked 3 times, then attempted to flee." The logic behind this wasn't completely unhinged. Well, not by medieval standards. People believed animals could be moral beings, capable of sin or evil. If a pig killed a child, it wasn't just seen as an unfortunate accident. It was viewed as a crime against society and against divine order. Justice had to be done. Sometimes the punishment was public execution. Yes, pigs were hanged, cows were burned, roosters were, well, exorcised, especially if they laid eggs, because apparently that was seen as witchcraft. Roosters don't lay eggs, so if one did, it was clearly the devil's doing. Medieval logic, folks. But it didn't stop there. Some trials were civil, not criminal. Rats could be sued for stealing grain. Locusts could be excommunicated for destroying crops. Monks would literally write legal summonses to bugs. And if the bugs didn't show up, well, they'd be cursed in absentia. You might think this was just rural superstition, but oh no. High-ranking clergy, trained lawyers, and educated judges were involved. This was the real deal. Trials could last weeks. Evidence was weighed. Verdicts were delivered. And animals lacking any legal defense of, "I'm a pig, what do you expect?" usually lost. In one case, a group of rats failed to show up for court. Their lawyer, yes, the rats had a lawyer, argued they had a legitimate excuse. The roads were unsafe. There were cats. The judge, in a moment of medieval mercy, postponed the hearing. Let's just take a second here to appreciate this. A real human being, wearing robes and a powdered wig, considered the possibility that rats were afraid of cats, and accepted it as a valid legal reason for absence. Honestly, that's kind of wholesome. So how did this even start? Why did medieval people decide that the family goat might need a public defender? The root lies in theology and Roman law. The church taught that sin affected all of creation, not just people. And Roman law had the idea that things, including animals, could be held responsible if they caused harm. Combine that with a society where the church and legal systems were deeply intertwined, and boom, animal trials. Also, let's not ignore the spectacle. Trials were public. Punishments were public. Executing a murderous pig sent a message. Justice was being done. Order was being restored. And people, peasants, farmers, townsfolk, got to see the law in action. Plus, it was kind of entertaining. A pig in chains? A goose on the witness stand? That's way more exciting than a tax dispute between noble cousins. It's tempting to laugh this off as pure medieval nonsense, but honestly, these trials tell us a lot about how people thought. They show a world where everything had meaning. If a cow got sick, maybe it was divine punishment. If a pig bit someone, it might be sin, not instinct. The line between spiritual and natural was blurry. Everything was part of a grand moral drama. And in some strange way, these trials gave people a sense of control, If animals could sin, they could also be punished. The world could be set right again. Of course, from our modern perspective, it's bizarre, but it's also kind of beautiful, in a chaotic, overly bureaucratic way. Imagine believing the world is so connected that even a beetle can be held accountable. So next time your dog chews your favorite shoes, just be grateful you're not in 1386 France. Because back then, that dog might have needed a good lawyer. All right, now that we've wrapped our minds around the idea of pigs being hanged and roosters getting exercised, you might be asking, was everyone in medieval Europe just really bored? Well, not quite. This wasn't about entertainment. It was about belief. Deep, bone-rooted belief in a world governed by divine order, cosmic justice, and a rather long list of things that could go terribly wrong if you didn't act accordingly. You see, to the medieval mind, everything, absolutely everything, had meaning. A hailstorm, God's warning, a cow giving birth to a two-headed calf, omen of doom, a goose honking at the bishop, probably a heretic in disguise, and if animals were part of God's creation, then they could also fall, just like people, into sin. That made them subject to divine and earthly justice, hence the courtroom. Now let's talk about the weirdest defendants of all, the insects. Picture this, a sleepy French village in the 15th century. The crops are failing, the villagers are hungry, and the cause of their suffering? A swarm of ravenous locusts. Naturally, they respond in the most logical way possible. They sue them. Yes, the entire swarm. The local bishop is brought in to hold court. He reads a legal summons aloud to the bugs. He gives them 3 days to vacate the region peacefully or face excommunication. I wish I were making this up. Sometimes, if the pests were especially stubborn, the monks would sprinkle holy water on the fields or erect tiny crosses to spiritually fence them out. And if that didn't work, curses. Official Latin-laced curses straight from the church's legal arsenal. Now let's pause here because I know what you're thinking. Were these people out of their medieval minds? Maybe, or maybe not. Let's not forget, these were societies where science wasn't separate from religion. Cause and effect were spiritual matters. If your crops died, something had to be blamed. And if the bugs weren't obeying God's plan, they needed to be held accountable. In a way, these trials were a desperate attempt at control in a world filled with chaos. If your only tools are prayer, ritual, and some seriously thick law books, well, that's what you use. But it wasn't all rural superstition and hay bale justice. In 1519, in the town of Stelvio, Italy, a group of farmers brought charges against a bunch of moles. Yes, moles. The diggy, blind, dirt-loving kind. Their crime? Destroying crops, tunneling through fields, and general disruption of the peace. The court actually considered whether the moles had souls. No, seriously, they debated it. In the end, the court ruled that the moles must vacate the land within 6 days. A designated clergyman was sent to stand in the field, read the order aloud, and bless the ground. If the moles didn't comply, they'd be excommunicated. It's almost poetic, yelling holy threats into a field, hoping the moles were listening. But these trials weren't always so lighthearted. Sometimes they carried real weight. Take the case of Bartholomew Chassenet, one of the most famous animal defense lawyers in history. Yes, that's a real title. In the early 1500s, Chassenet made his name defending a group of rats who had been summoned to court for stealing barley. When the rats failed to appear, as rats often do, the prosecution demanded justice. But Chassenet argued that the rats had not willfully ignored the summons. Oh no, they were simply unable to travel safely to court because of the presence of hostile cats along the route. Genius, right? He requested that the court ensure safe passage for the rats. Unsurprisingly, the case collapsed into absurdity, and the rats escaped legal punishment. But Chassenet? He went on to become a celebrated legal mind, all thanks to some clever thinking and a few imaginary rodents. This whole phenomenon, animal trials, is bizarre, yes. But it's also revealing. It shows how deeply humans crave order, meaning, justice. Even when justice requires a lawyer for a chicken or a summons for a swarm of fleas. And it raises some unexpected questions. Were these people really more irrational than we are today? Or did they just operate under a different logic? One shaped by faith, fear, and the desperate desire to understand a chaotic world? In fact, some scholars believe these trials were symbolic. By putting a pig on trial, they weren't just punishing a beast. They were purging the guilt of the community. They were reaffirming their belief in a moral universe, one where even animals couldn't get away with murder. It sounds strange, but imagine if today, every time your dog chewed up a shoe, he had to appear in court. Your Honor, the defendant pleads adorable. Or if the neighborhood squirrels were held liable for stealing birdseed. It's ridiculous, and yet oddly satisfying. Because beneath the absurdity lies something very human. The need to make sense of suffering. The urge to hold someone.
So now that we've tried pigs, cursed roosters, and summoned rats to court, what's next? Well, how about putting a corpse on trial? Yes, you heard that right. Welcome to one of the most bizarre chapters in medieval legal history, the Cadaver Synod. The year is 897 AD, Rome, the Eternal City. Only, things are feeling so eternal right now. The papacy is in turmoil, power is shifting, alliances are cracking, and revenge is in the air. The kind of revenge that doesn't stop just because you're dead. Enter Pope Stephen VI, a man with a grudge. Stephen's enemy? Formosus, a former pope who had the audacity to die peacefully the year before. But apparently, dying doesn't get you off the hook when politics are involved. Stephen wants revenge, not just metaphorical revenge. Literal, courtroom, robes and all revenge. So he digs up Formosus's corpse. Picture this, a group of monks exhuming a nearly decayed body from its tomb, dressing it up in papal robes, sitting it upright in a chair in the middle of a courtroom. That's not the start of a horror movie, that's real history. This surreal event would come to be known as the Cadaver Synod, a trial where the defendant was already rotting. Stephen had the corpse propped up on a throne. Behind him, the church's top officials. In front of him, judges, witnesses, and Stephen himself, yelling accusations at a man who couldn't exactly argue back. And because even absurdity needs structure, the court appointed a deacon to serve as Formosus's defense attorney. Just imagine, you're a young monk trying to get promoted, and someone taps you on the shoulder like, "Hey, we need you to defend a corpse in court today. Just try not to lose." The charges? Formosus was accused of perjury, violating canon law, and illegally assuming the papacy, none of which he could respond to, on account of being very, very dead. Still, the trial went on. Stephen ranted, witnesses testified, and after a dramatic performance that would have made daytime TV jealous, the court declared Formosus guilty. Now, what do you do with a guilty corpse? You strip it of its sacred robe. You cut off its blessing fingers. Yes, just the fingers used to perform blessing. You drag the body through the streets. And finally, you throw it in the Tiber River. Because when medieval people held a grudge, they really committed to it. But here's the kicker. Public opinion hated this. The people of Rome were horrified. Not because they loved Formosus, necessarily, but because this whole affair was just too grotesque, too theatrical, too unholy. Stephen's enemies pounced. Just months later, Stephen was imprisoned, deposed, and strangled to death in his cell. And Formosus? His body was retrieved from the river and reburied in honor. Because apparently, even in death, you can make a comeback. The Cadaver Synod is often held up as one of the weirdest legal proceedings in history, and rightly so. But it wasn't entirely unique in spirit. You see, medieval Europe didn't draw neat lines between justice, theology, and symbolism. To modern eyes, this all looks unhinged. But back then, trials were as much about cosmic order as they were about laws. You weren't just punishing someone, you were restoring balance between heaven and earth, even if that meant yelling at a corpse in front of horrified monks. This chapter in history is a reminder of just how powerful belief can be, how it shapes institutions, justifies the absurd, and sometimes turns death itself into a stage for political theater.
Okay, so we've seen pigs hanged, rats sued, and a pope's corpse dragged into court. You'd think medieval Europe would take a break from bizarre legal drama, right? Nope, not even close. Let's return to the world of animal trials. Because believe it or not, we haven't even scratched the surface of how seriously people took these fluffy criminals. Now let's jump to Switzerland, early 15th century, a town called Lausanne, nestled near a lake, charming, peaceful, and under attack. By whom? Little insects, more specifically, weevils, tiny beetles, harmless looking, but apparently absolutely savage when it came to vineyards. The townspeople were livid. These bugs were destroying their crops, eating through their grapes, ruining wine production. And if there's one thing medieval people wouldn't stand for, it was bad wine. So what did they do? They sued the weevils, legitimately. They hired lawyers, filed legal complaints. The weevils were summoned to court. This wasn't just symbolic. These trials were formally opened. The church was involved. The town council presided. Legal documents were drafted with all the pomp of an actual criminal case. And here's the twist that'll make you raise an eyebrow. The weevils had a defense lawyer. Yes, a human being with a law degree, or at least a robe and some confidence, stood up and defended a bunch of beetles. And he didn't just wing it. He made real arguments. He claimed that the weevils, as creatures of God, had a right to live, that they were simply following their natural instincts, not committing evil, that punishing them was unjust, maybe even sacrilegious. Okay, so we've seen pigs hanged, rats sued, and a pope's corpse dragged into court. You'd think medieval Europe would take a break from bizarre legal drama, right? Nope, not even close. Let's return to the world of animal trials, because believe it or not, we haven't even scratched the surface of how seriously people took these fluffy criminals. Now let's jump to Switzerland, early 15th century, a town called Lausanne, nestled near a lake, charming, peaceful, and under attack. By whom? Little insects, more specifically, weevils, tiny beetles, harmless looking, but apparently absolutely savage when it came to vineyards. The townspeople were livid. These bugs were destroying their crops, eating through their grapes, ruining wine production. And if there's one thing medieval people wouldn't stand for, it was bad wine. So what did they do? They sued the weevils, legitimately. They hired lawyers, filed legal complaints. The weevils were summoned to court. This wasn't just symbolic. These trials were formally opened. The church was involved. The town council presided. Legal documents were drafted with all the pomp of an actual criminal case. And here's the twist that'll make you raise an eyebrow. The weevils had a defense lawyer. Yes, a human being with a law degree, or at least a robe and some confidence, stood up and defended a bunch of beetles. And he didn't just wing it. He made real arguments. He claimed that the weevils, as creatures of God, had a right to live, that they were simply following their natural instincts, not committing evil, that punishing them was unjust, maybe even sacrilegious. The court took it seriously. The townspeople responded with classic medieval logic. They agreed the weevils had God-given rights, but also politely requested they leave town. So the court issued an official order. The weevils were commanded to vacate the vineyards within a specific time frame. Spoiler alert, they did not. Shocking, I know. Turns out beetles can't read court orders. Eventually, the town gave up and tried other methods. A little pesticide here, a little fire there. But for a moment in history, they really thought they could negotiate a peaceful bug relocation through the legal system. And Lausanne wasn't alone. Throughout Europe, from France to Italy to Germany, towns filed lawsuits against frogs, moles, flies, and even worms. Some lawsuits were criminal. You ate our crops, now face judgment. Others were civil. You're a nuisance, so please leave. But always, there was due process. Always, someone stood in court and tried to reason on behalf of the animals. In one French case, a group of farmers sued a swarm of locusts. The locusts, through their lawyer, of course, requested more time to respond. The court granted it. Why? Because it rained that day and the bugs didn't show up. You can't make this up. And look, we laugh now. Because yes, it's ridiculous. But for the medieval mind, this wasn't a joke. It was a mix of law, theology, and superstition. Everything was seen through the lens of divine order. If a weevil was eating your grapes, it wasn't just a pest. It was a challenge to the balance between man, God, and nature. So it had to be resolved, respectfully, legally, and with a straight face. And there's something kind of admirable about that. Sure, it's weird, but it speaks to a world where everything was woven into a moral fabric, where every action, even by a beetle, could have cosmic implications. Compare that to modern courtrooms, where most cases involve tax fraud, parking tickets, and overly aggressive HOA boards. Maybe, just maybe, medieval courts were weird, but also kind of fascinating, because they saw the world as deeply connected, even if that meant yelling at cows and handing out eviction notices to insects. So before we close tonight's little stroll through courtroom chaos, I have one last tale for you, a short one, but oh, it's a gem. Let's head back to 15th century Basel, Switzerland, where the townsfolk woke up to a mystery that shook their understanding of, well, chicken biology. A hen had laid an egg. So far, so normal, right? Wrong, because this wasn't just any egg. This egg was perfectly round, not oval, but a full circle. And this apparently was very bad news. Why? Because in medieval Europe, a round egg meant witchcraft. Some believed it could hatch a basilisk, a mythical serpent so deadly it could kill you with a glance. Basically, the Voldemort of farm animals. So what did the town do? Did they inspect it, call a farmer, consult a chicken expert? Number. They arrested the chicken. The poor hen was put on trial, accused of being in league with the devil. Witnesses were called, the egg was examined. The defense, well, there wasn't much of one. She was a chicken after all. The verdict, guilty. The punishment, burned at the stake. Yep, they burned a chicken for laying a weird egg. And as absurd as it sounds, this case is historically documented. Because for medieval minds, the line between natural and supernatural was incredibly thin. A round egg was suspicious, and suspicion meant consequences, even for poultry. So next time you're making breakfast and you crack open an egg, be grateful you're not being watched by a medieval judge with a torch. Friendly outro, final minute. So hey, if you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. I hope tonight's journey through the weirdest animal trials in history gave you a smile, a shiver, or maybe just a head shake of, what were they thinking? Before you go, let me know in the comments what you thought of this episode. And if you've ever heard a weirder story than a rooster being excommunicated. And hey, if you enjoyed this, give the video a quick like. It seriously helps the channel more than you know. I've got plenty more strange corners of history to explore with you. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next bizarre tale. For now, dim the lights, fluff the pillow, and drift off knowing your pet cat probably won't need a lawyer in the morning. Good night, and I'll see you in the next one.